Today I'm covering Game 4 of the greatest blitz match ever played. So this was a 16 game match between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja. It was the Banter Blitz Cup Final, played in April 2020. The match score is on screen, 1.5 each. So Alireza has the white pieces in this game. What can he bring to Magnus in this one? So he kicks off with pawn to e4 and Magnus repeats the Alekhine defence. So e5 was played by Alireza. We had these opening moves here, and now knight f3. Alireza once again decides not to go pawn to c4. So we had a captures here, the knight recaptured, pawn to g6, and now Alireza's the first one to deviate. He goes bishop to d3. In game 1, he went bishop to e2. Now Magnus goes bishop g7. Both players castled here. The rook came to the e-file, and now Magnus could have played pawn c5 immediately, a break he wants to get in this position, but first he starts with knight d7, challenging this strong centralised knight. Now you can take here. Instead Alireza decides to drop it back to f3, and now after pawn c5 he can meet that break with pawn c4. After the knight hops in here, he can go pawn to d5. If that knight was still there, he wouldn't have been able to achieve this. Now he's giving the bishop pair by playing like this, but what he says on his stream is, okay, black can get the bishops, but I've got some nice central space. And Magnus didn't take immediately because after the queen recaptures, b5 is a very thematic break, which we see Magnus play, but this is a slightly better version of the game than what we saw for the white pieces. So instead of taking immediately, Magnus goes pawn b5 first. Now best here was to just take that pawn, and now you could have bishop to b7, pressuring here. Black's going to win the pawn back. Very interesting double-edged position. Instead, Alireza went bishop to e4 here. Now it's a nice move to put some pressure here, step away from the knight, although it does walk into new attacks. f5 was actually very interesting here, although it looks very anti-positional to give the e6 square. So instead Magnus goes knight to f6, hitting that bishop, and now pawn a3 was played by Alireza, kicking this strong knight. Now Magnus could have looked at retreating this one here, and after pawn recaptures he can sit it back on c7. We'll get similar lines with the bishop coming to b7, knight c3, black will win back the pawn. Interesting game. But instead of retreating this knight, Magnus instead took here. Now you don't want to recapture with the rook. Then bishop f5 comes, and if the rook retreats, say to e2 to cover the c2 square from this knight, well then it can come into d3. Black's got a really nice initiative. So after the knight took on e4 here, Alireza took on b4 instead. The knight now retreated out of the attack of the rook. It allowed Alireza to take on c5, but now the knight finds a square on c4, and you can't push b3 or you lose your rook in the corner here to this bishop. So instead we had knight to c3, Magnus kicked on with pawn b4, and he was hoping that this small initiative would give him some compensation for these menacing pawns. So the knight could have come to e4 now, actually chucking that b2 pawn and going for some initiative. Instead, Alireza went to a4, not a bad move, it holds the b2 pawn, but Magnus is now trying to keep this one stranded out of the game and hoping he can play against that. And now Alireza said, bishop g5 is a big threat here, and Magnus recognised the same. He can't play too slowly, so he went pawn to e6, immediately targeting the big centre. Alireza kicked on, and although Magnus has given these two connected passed pawns, at least he gets bishop b7. Those pawns are stymied for the moment, they're not going anywhere, and this one finds a really nice diagonal. So the bishop now came to g5, a superb move from Alireza. Not necessarily the best when you run it through an engine. It wants things like bishop e3 or even just a pawn move here, but he goes for these super tactical lines, mixing it up, and it looks like you're just blundering a piece. Because after bishop takes on f3, which is what Magnus played, this one's no longer defended. So if you take with the queen, well, you're losing a piece here. If you take the black queen, well, now black takes here. Again, is going to be emerging a piece up. So what did Alireza have in mind after bishop takes on f3? If you want to pause and look for the move, please do so. And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button, let me know. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, do consider subscribing, never miss a future video. So here Alireza played queen to c1. He's a whole piece down, he's stepping away from the attack, but he's now attacking this one on c4. He's still attacking this bishop, and he's defending his own bishop. So Magnus now plays pawn to f6, counter-attacking on the white bishop, cutting the attack on his queen. Alireza now took on f3, which is the best move, and now Magnus chucks in this knight captures on d6 move. After the pawn takes back, then he picks up on g5. So he's currently a pawn up, but now the rook takes on e6, levelling up the material. And we can see white is for choice here. This passed pawn is very dangerous now, and the white pieces are just generally more active than black's. So the rook now came to c8. I should just mention, if you take on f3, this is no good because now queen c6 can come. Just as a general principle, you can't go hunting pawns when you haven't yet activated all of your pieces. So Magnus gets this. He plays rook to c8, hitting the queen. And now queen d1 was a lovely move from Alireza. It covers this pawn, yes, but more importantly, it looks at this d5 square, it looks at the b3 square. These light squares are the critical ones in the position, so that's why he brings it to d1 and not, say, d2. And now Magnus goes queen a5. He wants to prevent queen to d5, and so that's why he goes for this one. And it also means that after queen b3, king h8, rook d1, he can switch the queen over to the f-file, which he now does, and try and generate some counterplay. He's worse through the centre of the board, so he has to try and mix it up. Now here's a great move from Firouzja. He understands when to transition. So this pawn is attacked. Say you go king g2, this is a mistake, because then g4 comes and you're ripping things open. You can't take here or you're dropping on f2. If you try and, say, defend that pawn, well, you're losing your initiative. You'd have to play, say, pawn f4. The whole point being that black is coming back into the game. So instead of going king g2, Alireza goes pawn to d7 first. The rook comes to the d-file and then queen d5. So he's taking the queens off the board. He understands that transition into an endgame will be favourable for him because not only does he have the powerful rooks, but the knight is coming to c5 and then b7 very quickly. So Magnus tries to avoid it. Alireza insists. Magnus drops back again. Alireza insists again. And here, low of time, Magnus obliges. So the rook recaptures. And now bishop to f6 came, giving the king some room, covering the d8 square. Excellent move. And both players are down to about 30 seconds now, slightly even less. Magnus's defence here was just impeccable. So the pawn now came to b3. Best was actually starting with the knight c5, because if you chop off this pawn, actually this knight's coming to e6 or b7 very, very quickly. Now Alireza starts with pawn b3, just taking care of that one first. He's still better, but it wasn't actually necessary. The bishop came to e7, the rook came to e6, hitting it, rook f7 defended. This rook activated into the game, king g7 played, and now rook a6 starts to target this one. That's indefensible, so bishop f8 was played. It pressures this pawn, forces rook a7 to hold this one, and now Magnus's best chance here for counterplay was rook takes on f3. Not just because you're pawn grabbing, but say you come with knight b6, which we saw in the game, preparing rook a8, well now Magnus can pick up here. And say you had a line like this, similar to what we saw in the game, well at least Magnus is getting some counterplay with this b-pawn. But what we saw here after rook takes on a7 was that Magnus went king to f6. I mean, he's very short on time, I think less than 10 seconds by this point. But this allowed a check. It drives the king back. Now the knight came to b6, you're an extra tempo up on those last variations. We had rook f6 here, but the rook now came to a8. You don't have time to take the knight, or then you lose your rook. So instead we had bishop e7, covering the rook. We had an exchange here. The knight came to c8 now, and again Magnus's best shot was taking on f3 here, but he comes to the c file instead. We had rook to d3 covering these pawns. Now the rook checked and then came to c3. You can't take here or this one's going through. So Alireza moved the rook away, Magnus picked up here, and now Alireza recycles this knight back into the game. And now the best move for Magnus was to go rook to a3, for the reason being that after knight b7, attacking the bishop, threatening to queen the pawn, you've then got rook to a8, covering the square. But what Magnus did was go rook to c3, so he's clearing the way for this pawn, but now after knight b7, you can't bring your rook to the back rank. So instead bishop f6 was played, the pawn queened, we had a captures here, and now pawn to b3 came. And the players are on literally seconds here, of course, we have to remember. And you see that in the next couple of moves. So knight e6 check played, the king came to f6, and now Alireza moves that one away to c7. But it just literally hangs the piece to the rook, but Magnus equally had no time. He played king e5, hitting the rook. I mean, they're just pre-moving at this point. Rook e4 check, king d6, but this walks into a fork. So Alireza jumps in with the knight now, knight b5 check, forking king and rook, and here Magnus resigned. If you enjoyed this game and want to see more in this playlist, then click here, and I hope to see you again on the next video. Thanks for watching.